in the intricate web and criminal relationships? What about the economic factors that fuel these conflicts and the societal tolerance of prevailing impunity? Do governments genuinely seek to resolve criminal networks, or do they find themselves drawn into the ongoing engagement? What is the role of military Mexican forces in these network dynamics, and what rules they impose to the criminal environment? Penny Lake has fiercely addressed these issues in her podcast and media outlets. For those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. We will begin with an initial round of interventions from our speakers, followed by a second round of elaboration and ideas and discussion. We will also incorporate comments from the Q&A section during this time. So please, we kindly request that you utilize the Q&A section at this platform. And with this, I will give the floor to Oscar Contreras. He's now speaking from the University of California at Los Angeles, where he develops research, and he is very, very close to closing a very interesting dissertation. So Oscar has published a recent paper on these issues, and he's more than welcome to join and to share his ideas. Oscar.
Thank you, Isa. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And if you are okay with me, I'll sharing the screen and starting my presentation. I'm going to, let me just. Okay. Can you all see?
Yes, we can see perfectly.
Okay, great. So, this particular research was, as Isa mentioned, was recently published in an article titled "Unintended Consequences of State Action: How the Kingpin Strategy Transformed the Structure of Violence in Mexico's Organized Crime," in the journal Trends in Organized Crime. It basically addresses the how and why has violence related to organized crime increased in Mexico over the last 2 decades or so. What have been the mechanisms that have led to this process? And while there are many important scholars, both in Mexico, the United States, and elsewhere, that have proposed different perspectives on this, I will focus on the militarization aspect, right, of public safety as a causal mechanism, and the war on drugs, right, that started in 2007 with ex-president Felipe Calderón, and even more specifically on the Kingpin strategy, which is essentially the capturing or killing of these of the leaders of these criminal organizations. Now, I'm not going to address the theoretical or methodological aspect of these research because of time, but if you're interested, I invite you to read the full article on the website journal of the journal Trends in Organized Crime, or feel free to reach out to me and I can send you a copy of the article. The methods that I use are a mix of social network analysis, structural balance theory, and other methods to basically show how the Kingpin strategy has failed, right? And it had ultimately the opposite effect that it originally intended, right? So I use data on violent conflicts between Mexico's criminal organizations from 2004 to 2020 from the Uppsala conflict data program. I'm going to tell you a bit more about this data set, which is a public data set. And I have basically three working hypotheses, if you will, that are associated to the general hypothesis that basically says that the Kimping strategy was or led to negative consequences, right? It was a strategy that led to negative consequences. First, or the first part of the hypothesis is that the Kimping strategy is associated with the fragmentation of criminal organizations in Mexico. The second part is that these criminal organizations developed a set of structurally balanced arrangements. And I'm going to explain a bit more about this idea of structurally balanced before the government waged war against them, and that the Kimping strategy disrupted these arrangements, which led to an increase in the number of violent conflicts and violence in general. And third, that the fragmentation of these criminal organizations also produced a process of geographical clustering of violence. So before I start tackling my hypothesis, I'm going to very briefly talk about the idea of balance in very simple terms. I'm going to avoid all the technicalities and stuff, just to focus on the important ideas here. Structural balance was originally a psychological model of human relations that asserted that one person's relationship, either positive or negative with another, is interdependent upon their evaluation or attitude towards a third person or entity. And according to this theory, balance can be achieved in two ways: either if two of the three relations are negative, and here we're talking about triads, which is like the most basic unit of analysis, right? Three entities, in this case, three organizations, criminal organizations. So balance can be achieved if two of the three relations are either negative, or if all relations among the three actors are positive, right? So if everyone likes each other, that is the first case that you see on your left of the screen, or if two organizations are allies or friends and they have a common enemy. Anything else will be unbalanced. And this logic is reflected in aphorisms about how parties may swear allegiance or declare war based on feuds or loyalties with third parties, and is associated to the sayings, the friend of a friend is a friend, or the friend of an enemy is an enemy, and so on. What's important here, and the main takeaway of why this theory is useful to understand the relationships between criminal organizations, and more specifically in the context of violence, is that any unbalanced configuration leads to more conflicts, and in this case, more violent conflicts, right? So on average, on any balanced configuration, you will expect one conflict, right? You have two possible balanced configurations, on average, one conflict per balanced configuration. And under unbalanced configurations, you have a total of 4 potential conflicts, on average, 2 violent conflicts per unbalanced configurations. In other words, unbalanced configurations will have twice as many, on average, twice as many, will lead to twice as many conflicts. So sample gathering for these research consisted of 2 stages. I'm not gonna go too deep into the whole methods and how I did it, but I wanted to mention the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. This is one of the most comprehensive data sets on violent conflicts that are publicly available, and tracks violent conflicts worldwide since 1975. It's an amazing source of information in terms of conflicts. It consistently tracks violent conflicts in Mexico between non-state actors, which was my main focus, since 2004. And that is why I focused on that period from 2004 to 2020. And choosing this period allowed me to observe the structure of conflicts and alliances between criminal organizations before and after the federal government decided to wage the war on drugs. Just to give you an idea of the initial sample, the initial sample included over 7,000 violent deaths, events between 43 criminal organizations, accounting for an estimated 59,139 violent deaths. Now, in order to test balance, I didn't only need the conflicts, the information on conflicts, which was provided by the UCDP data set, but I also needed information on their alliances, right? And this was a much more complicated task. So I had to choose only those organizations of which I had enough information to track their alliances from 2004 to 2020. And this forced me to use a different method, which were basically a mix of archival methods, right? And even though I only focused on these 11 organizations for this part of the analysis, they account for over 70% of all the violence produced during this period. So it's still a very, a very important subset of the initial sample. So again, I don't want to go too much into the technical component of this, but for the first hypothesis, I ran several models in order to understand the relationship between the kingpin strategy and the fragmentation of these criminal organizations. And across all my models, the association was statistically significant, right? So there is an association between the beheading of criminal organizations and their almost immediate fragmentation. For my second hypothesis, which is associated to the idea of structural balance, there are three things that I wanted to note here. First, and just to remind you of the hypothesis, because it's not written here. The second hypothesis was that criminal organizations developed a set of structurally balanced arrangements before the war on drugs, and the kingpin strategy disrupted these arrangements, right? Which led to an increase in the number of violent conflicts. So first, you see an increase in the number of organizations in the network, right? That is the very first thing that you see. And these organizations are in the form of nodes, right? So that is why I highlighted the column nodes here, because I did the analysis using social networks or in the form of social networks. Number two, you see an increase in the number of conflicting edges. And these conflicting edges are basically conflicts between these criminal organizations. And the increase is very steep, right? So you go from 3 conflicts in 2004, 3 main conflicts, to around 24 conflicts by 2012, right? So there's a very steep increase in the number of violent conflicts. The third thing to note is that balance or structural balance was achieved until 2010. So after 2010, there seems to be a tipping point that led the whole network to become unbalanced, right? And so what happened, right? Because the question is, well, what was this tipping point that led to the whole network become unbalanced? And in other words, a bit like chaotic, if that makes sense. So this is a way of, to understand or to see the network from the perspective of structural balance. From 2004 to 2007, you see 4 organizations fighting each other. Interrelated with each other with 3 very clear conflicts. These are the Sinaloa cartel, the Juarez cartel, the Tijuana, and the Gulf cartel. By 2009, you have a splinter, right? So the government already had started to wage its war on drugs and to implement the Kingpin strategy. There's a splinter, the Beltran Leiva organization splinters from the Sinaloa cartel. However, very interestingly, at this point, the structure seems to be, the network seems to be resilient, right? And so it sort of like readjusts itself in a way that it's still achieving structural balance. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, after 2011, everything becomes a bit more chaotic in a way, or in other words, structurally unbalanced. What happened in 2010? So I'm gonna briefly touch on three case studies in order to exemplify the idea of fragmentation, but also to sort of explain in a way why 2010 was an important year. The year 2010 marked a shift in the configuration of conflicts and alliances. So the Zetas, this very ruthless criminal organization, drug trafficking organization, split from the Gulf cartel and started a very violent war that spilled all over the country. The Zetas, just to give a very brief context, were formed in 1999 when Osiel Cárdenas Guillén, a notorious leader of the Gulf cartel, lured more than 30 soldiers from the Mexican Special Forces to work for him. And in 2007, Cárdenas Guillén was captured by the government and extradited into the United States. Now, his brothers, Antonio and Eduardo Costilla, also known as El Cos, took charge. But in 2010, Antonio was gunned down by the military, right? So again, we see the strategy being implemented. And Eduardo, the other brother, took charge of the cartel. These almost immediately created internal fractions, right? An internal fraction. And the Zetas decided to start their own operations, right? Which fueled a war immediately with the Gulf cartel. And of course, dissatisfied, the Gulf cartel forged an alliance with the Sinaloa cartel and the Familia Michoacana to fight off the Zetas. That same year, in the state of Michoacán, La Familia Michoacana had been fighting off the Zetas when they were like allied to the Gulf cartel. They had been fighting them for years. But in 2010, the leader, Nazario Moreno Gonzalez, was allegedly gunned down in a shootout with the federal police. And these led to a split among cartel leaders. One faction stayed with the La Familia Michoacana, and the other created a new organization called or known as Los Caballeros Templarios, the Knights Templar. They called themselves a self-defense movement focused on expelling their organization from Michoacán, and took the name of the medieval military religious order, the Knights Templar. So that is the second example. The third example is another vicious, very vicious organization, Cártel Jalisco Nueva Generación, also emerged in 2010 after former Sinaloa Sinaloa cartel capo Ignacio Coronel Villarreal was killed by the Mexican military. So there was another splintering. They actually belonged to Cartel Milenio, which were allied to the Sinaloa cartel. But anyways, that's where the splinter comes from. And the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación has been associated with the use of extreme, as we know, the use of extreme forms of violence against enemy civilians and state agents alike. So these three sort of cases provide evidence for what the numbers showed in both my models, in terms of how the Kingpin strategy produces fragmentation and at the same time imbalance in the network of criminal organizations. 2010 seems to be the tipping point, because the network just couldn't keep up with the number of splinters that were created that same year. And finally, my third hypothesis is that fragmentation led to a process of geographical clustering of violence. As you can see in this map, from 2004 to 2007, there were clearly 4 organizations fighting in 3 conflicts all over the country. Cities like Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez were, of course, of particular importance because they're important entryways into the United States. And of course, drug trafficking organizations have historically fought to gain or maintain their control. And likewise, ports like Acapulco and Mazatlan are vital because they allow organizations to control big shipments of drugs and precursors into Mexico and then into the United States. And you can see a lot of violence in those regions. Now, interestingly, by 2008, which is when 1 year after the war on drugs started, and all the way until 2012, which is when President Felipe Calderon's presidency ended, you see more organizations. You see 19 organizations fighting in 14 violent conflicts. And you start to see this process of clustering of these conflicts, right? Which is more evident in the period between 2013 to 2020, where we have 43 organizations fighting over 30 different in over 30 conflicts. And now you see clearly a sort of like clustering of these conflicts. Here you see them in different colors. But what I saw when I was looking at the data, what I saw, visually in these maps had to be tested somehow. So in order for me to test for the clustering violence, I used something called a modularity test, and I used the Louvain method for community detection. This is a very common method used in social network analysis to understand the structure of a network and to look for sub-networks within the larger network, if that makes sense. And this allowed me to observe whether there is an increase in the number of clusters of conflicts in the network between 2004 and 2020. So the figure that you see here shows how the number of clusters of violent conflicts consistently increased from 1 in 2004 to 7 clusters in 2020. So this confirms the hypothesis that not only do we observe a greater number of conflicting organizations in 2020 compared to 2004, but that these organizations clustered together in smaller and more localized conflicts over time. So to wrap up, the Keeping strategy led as a failed government strategy, led to the fragmentation of criminal organizations. These fragmentation led to unstable arrangements, or was associated to unstable arrangements between organizations after the war on drugs. And this fragmentation also led to a process of geographical clustering of violence throughout the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar, for this very, very, very timely presentation as well. One of the things that caught my attention from your paper is that you were proposing further research regarding the military forces' influence and how they play into these clusters. I think that was fascinating, and I hope you can elaborate more on the second round for us, please. So now I give the floor to Rafael Prieto Curiel, who describes himself as a researcher applying maths to crime, but he's much more applying many other methods also in context and his knowledge from professional experience to his research. He is based on the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. And welcome, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Isa, and thank you very much, Oscar, for the fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think you're looking at my screen now. And I'm going to just start talking. So this is a project about modeling cartels in Mexico, and this led my part because I'm a mathematician from Mexico City that used to work for the police department in Mexico City for like 5 years. So my experience is actually in crime and trying to model crime with different aspects, geography, differential equations, statistics, time series, and so on. I called Alejandro Hope, that hopefully you know him because he was one of the big names in crime analysis a few years ago. And for years, I admired his work, and I was like, I want to work with him. And then I thought, you know what, Alejandro, I think I have a project I want to pitch for you. So actually, that's how it started in 2021, I think. Then we decided to also incorporate into the project our colleague Gian Maria. Gian Maria is a crime analyst from Italy that is specialized in mafia recruitment. So the three of us worked together for this project, and unfortunately, Alejandro passed away right in the middle of the submission processes and so on. So it's been a very sad moment for us because obviously we miss Alejandro so much, but also because he didn't know the reach of all the research and all the process that he did, right? So Gian Maria and I, we see the work a bit of like a legacy from Alejandro. And every time I want to mention, this is also part of Alejandro's work. And I mean, obviously, because you're from Mexico and we saw the presentation from Oscar, you're maybe more familiar with cartels, but I always show photos of cartels just so that people understand what are we talking about. Otherwise, it looks like maybe small gangs or small organized groups, but no. In Mexico, we're talking about like something like an army that use social media and they want to show their presence and how they have big guns and big people, and they are actually quite intimidating if you see this. And if you compare now Mexico, unfortunately, with other countries, we are in the most violent parts of Earth. And we have been for years. Like, it's not like new that Mexico is so violent. But Mexico now is even more violent than Colombia or Brazil, that were historically more violent than us. Just slightly less violent than South Africa and some other countries. But basically now Mexico is the epicenter of the violence. And not only Mexico and the whole Latin America, we are together in this boat. And also the US, to be honest, because on the one side we suffer the violence and the homicides, but on the other side they suffer the drug overdose that today is killing 100,000 people per year. So like it's the same side of so it's two sides of the same issue that we're suffering. And Oscar showed this photo, but it's just so powerful for me to understand how this is the story of Mexican homicide in 30 years. And it seemed like we were doing okay somewhere around 2005, 2006. It was decreasing, we were there. And then eventually it all got ruined, right? And we have had ever since then 3 governments. And in these 3 different governments, we haven't been able to actually reduce violence, except for some promising wave that by the end of 2013 came. But really, if you just blink a bit, you will see that there's a positive trend. And by positive, I mean increasing, not positive as in the positive, wow, this is something to celebrate trend. It's super worrying. And it's not like we can stop it. And we have tried with 3 different presidents, 3 different parties, like we are actually not even close to doing something, right? So one of the big key relevant factors for me is the recruitment of cartels. Why? Because I started with the following idea. From cartels, they are almost like a black box. We cannot say almost anything because we cannot actually ask a survey. We cannot have a census of cartel members. We cannot count them. For me, they are like a black box. Inside this black box, there are many things, structures, weapons, reasons, finance, and so on. But this black box is producing something that is the time series that we saw, the number of homicides, and that second time series, that is the number of people that we can incapacitate. So those are the 2 things that come out of this black box, and that's it. The rest for me is something that you can infer, you can basically maybe sometimes know, like Oscar presented, but basically it's just inferring from very limited data. But if we know those two, homicides and people into the penitentiary system in Mexico, I thought we could do something. And do something is, okay, imagine these black boxes, each cartel is one of these dots. And we say that a cartel gets bigger when they recruit. They get smaller when the army incapacitates them. That means arrests and then puts into a penitentiary system. Maturity, because as Oscar presented, maybe when a cartel gets too big, it's likely that it fragments into different pieces. So there's some process here of dividing into different things or just losing members because it's too big. And then finally, more important, conflict. So when one cartel fights the other, they kill members from both sides, and that's how they lose members, right? So you see, the most important part is that the cartel should be losing members because they get arrested. They lose members because they fragment each other. They lose members because they fight each other, so they keep losing members. And if that carries on for sufficient time, then eventually cartel should disappear, unless they recruit. That's the only reason, if you see the positive sign, is the only one that has a positive sign here. So that's why we say the only way that you can maintain this amount of violence for so many years is recruitment. So let's work the math. We have, and it's interesting here, Oscar, because we have 150 cartels from the data from the CIDE. You showed, I think, 43. We have a very unbalanced network sometimes. Here, every node represents a cartel, as in this one, the previous presentation. There is an edge between cartels if they fight. And this is data collected from CIDE, also from media appearances. And when two cartels appear and they fight each other, there is a line between them. And the more they fight, the thicker the line is. So you see, obviously, there are some big cartels like Cartel Jalisco, fighting Cartel Sinaloa, and so on. And then we also capture the alliances. And the alliances is a much more transparent network to see. We see that there is a big cartel called Cartel Jalisco with some satellite cartels nearby. There's Cartel Sinaloa with some satellite cartels there. And many isolated cartels that they don't have an alliance. They don't have a fight. They are just a tiny band, a tiny organized group somewhere, okay? Once you put these two together, it gives you an idea of this is how complicated it is, the network of fighting and cooperation in the cartels. Now, it's super interesting what Oscar was saying. Should we try to interfere with this network? Because for me, I want a policy. Should we make these cartels fight? Or is there a way to make a peace between cartels? Because that is going to change drastically the way the violence is observed in Mexico, right? So changing the structure here. However, what we did is, okay, let's put this system of they recruit, they fight, they get arrested, or they have internal conflicts, and the networks into a system of equations. The system of equations, looks a bit fancy just because I'm a mathematician. So of course I wanted the equations to look fancy, right? Otherwise they would criticize me for not being enough mathematician. But imagine an equation for each cartel. Is cartel 1 is equals to blah, blah, blah. It has this dot because it means that it's changing in time. That the size of the cartel is changing in time. And it changes because of these 4 things that we're going to see. One is the positive one, recruitment. The second, incapacitations, then conflict. And here in this SIJ is those networks and the interactions, maturity. Obviously, there are many assumptions here, and don't expect this model with only 4 numbers to try to explain the rest of the world. Like, it's only 4 numbers here as we have as parameters. So there are too many limitations in this model. But with 4 numbers that are this rho, eta, theta, and omega, the 4 Greek letters, we are trying to explain everything. only 4 numbers. So please really don't expect the universe to be explained with 4 numbers. And I cannot emphasize it enough because some people are like, oh, but you missed this or that. Yes, yes, we missed a lot of things, but still trying to estimate 4 numbers. As a mathematician, I'm a postdoctoral researcher. I have worked with maths for more than 10 years, professional in my career. Estimating 4 numbers took me months. If you add a 5th number, it would take me years, you know? So you want to estimate as little as possible, 4 numbers. And the results, here I have to stop for a second. The results are not to be liked, are not to be praised because, wow, finally somebody came. But they have some political connotation, of course. So I published this article with Maria and Alejandro on a Friday, and on Monday we were mentioned by the president of Mexico. I wish it was more like a thank you, scientists, for helping us solve the problem in Mexico. Thank you for investing hours or maybe months of your time for doing this. But no, it was just calling me a conservative opponent of his government, whatever, Fifi, which I find extremely unprofessional from the government of Mexico, but I'm not surprised. To be honest, nobody should be. But ever since then, I have quite a few interactions with the media. So I've been in CNN with Adela, with CNN again, in Milenio, in TV in France, with Denise Merker, with Alejandro Pisanti. I was a lot in the media, so maybe you've seen my face a bit. But the results are the most controversial one was this one. Which are the top employers in Mexico? And we said, sorry, not we. Grupo Expansión publishes in 2022 who are the biggest companies in Mexico, and the biggest companies are FEMSA, the Coca-Cola company, Walmart, Manpower, a human resources company, America Mobile, a phone company, and then finally cartels. Because what we estimated is that cartels have 175,000 members. That is the number that we estimated, and it should be between 160 and 195. There is very little space for them to be much bigger or much smaller. Because much smaller, it would be that they recruit too much for not disappearing. If they are bigger, then they don't recruit, but then they should be fragmented elsewhere. So must give you this number and this estimate. There are other companies. Now, that is the estimate that we gave. That is what caught the media attention more, that this is the 5th largest employer, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to put it like this because for me, it puts it into a context. Like, what is the size of the enemy that we're fighting? No? What is the size of the monster? Because you can also say they don't fit in the Zócalo Square because there are so many cartel members that they don't fit in the Zócalo Square. But there are so many cartel members that they cannot be fought with the army because there's a 2-to-1. Maybe Penile will mention this. But for me, it was just putting it in the context of the number of employees of other companies. But let me show you the results that for me are more relevant. First, a very mathsy one is, imagine that the number of cartels is somewhere here. The arrows are pointing to the left, telling you that the police, if the number of cartels is, let's say, 10 members or 100 members or 1,000 members, they would eventually converge to the yellow dot. Eventually, they would disappear. And there is a scenario with a small recruitment. What happens if there is medium recruitment? Then eventually we see the maths being slightly more sophisticated, slightly more tricky, until we have this new scenario. Here, tells you that if there is a small number of cartel members, then eventually the police can dissolve them. However, there is a new moment that is these red arrows that show you that if instead of 10 cartel members, eventually there would be 11, they would grow and grow and grow. Here, from here, even if the police tries to stop them, they cannot, because the cartel actually compensates the losses. And so after this moment, this is something that we call a bifurcation. the cartel actually grows larger and larger until this new dot. Here, by the way, even if we are on the other side, the police dissolves them until this point. So this system, for me, explains why in Austria, we don't have mafias. Or if we do, they are not violent. And whenever they appear, they are so small that the police can dissolve them, because the system already takes them always to zero. And the same happens in Switzerland, Finland, England, Denmark. However, here is where we are in Latin America. Here is Colombia, Brazil, Peru, or Mexico, where we have a small number of cartel members. And even if the police keeps trying and trying and trying, the cartel actually manages to increase the losses that they have to a new stable equilibrium. Here, this is a very massive but super relevant result. Even if the police tries to arrest more members, already here we have a stable equilibrium. That means it's like a football in a valley where you want to kick the ball away, but the ball eventually returns to that valley. Well, we are here, and we have tried for 18 years, and we haven't managed to move away from this equilibrium. One of the most challenging results is that we are in a stable equilibrium for the number of cartels, for the cartel size, and it is stable because of that, because they managed to recruit. Even if there are two cartels, so let me show you finally what happens if cartels. Now, instead of it being in time, imagine the horizontal axis has cartel 1, vertical axis has cartel 2, and this is Austria. If you have a number of cartels, eventually the arrows point to all the cartels are 0. So in Austria, they managed to disappear the cartels. However, when the cartels recruit more, now we start in a green dot, the police cannot stop them. And eventually we fall into this yellow dot. And if we're here, the police cannot stop them and we fall into the other yellow dot. And in Mexico, we have this scenario. And this is partly what Oscar was sharing is that we start here, and even if the police keeps arresting and keeps trying to arrest individuals, the system is bringing us to the one cartel being even bigger and cartels growing indefinitely, even if the police keeps arresting individuals. So this is one of the most relevant results, not 175,000 members, not fifth employer. This is the point. And this is the point because we also tried what will happen in the next 5 years. And in the next 5 years, if we carry the trends that we have today, because the math's enabled to do this, we're just going to have much more violence than we have today. If we have double incapacitation, and that is just because I used to work for the police, I know how to do this. If we double incapacitation because of the mathematical reasons that I showed you, we're just going to have more violence in the next 5 years. If we manage to reduce recruitment to half, eventually we're going to be less violent than today, but even more violent than we were in 2012. And this is tricky because 2012 was already too violent. And even if we have the recruitment, we're going to be more violent than 2012, right? So it's not going to be a magical solution. Finally, if we reduce recruitment to 0, absolute 0, we will still be more violent than most of the countries of the world. Even if we have 0 recruitment for the following 5 years, Mexico will be in the top most violent countries in the world. This is the message, not 175,000, not fifth largest employer. But I mean, it's just that what the media picked up is a system, a mathematical model that tries to capture and explain why are cartels so big and why we haven't been able to fix it for 18 years. And with that, I think I can finish my first intervention.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rafael, for putting all these points on the table. Definitely lets us wondering if the punitive strategy that is being applied not only in Mexico but Guatemala as well, in many other countries, is it enough? You know, now we wonder why it's not enough actually. So with that, I leave the floor to Penny Ramirez. Thank you, Penny, for being here. She has published many articles in media outlets on this, and she speaks to us from Futuro Media Group today. Thank you for being here with me.
Yeah, well, thank you, Isa, for the invitation. I have learned so much with both presentations from Oscar and Rafa. I interviewed Rafa recently for my weekly column in Colombia, and now I think I need to interview Oscar for another column. Because you have been, basically what you have been doing is to put it on a larger scale, on a more, let's say, big picture model, something that I have been putting on the ground. So I decided not to bring a presentation. At the beginning, I thought about a presentation about photos of myself in the marijuana fields in the north of Sinaloa, but I decided that it was better to tell you the story of how all of the things you have heard so far from Oscar and Rafa look like when you are on the field, when you're going there. And I have been taking notes to try to respond to some of the questions that you have been having from the, let's say, statistical, mathematical, and big picture model into how does that look when you actually go there. So I want to start with trying to address what's the difference between what you see when you are on the field about the ways that these networks work. And I want to start with the economic models of the cartels in Mexico. I will start with a little story of me traveling in Sinaloa, trying to find where were the airplane tracks that were used for moving marijuana from the Sinaloa mountains to the border with Mexico and the US. And basically I was like, okay, who is the leader, the leader here that can give me an interview? Back then I was a TV correspondent, so I was trying to locate exactly the place where the airplane came, landed, full the plane with drug, and then move that, especially marijuana and cocaine, from the mountains of Sinaloa to the border. And the first thing, and it is important, that's why I'm starting with this story, is that they say that there were not drug dealers there. So I was like, who are the drug dealers I can speak with? And they're not real drug dealers here. And I'm like, what? And the first important thing is that most of the people I have met in the field, they don't consider themselves as drug dealers. So if you ask them in Spanish, ¿tú eres narcotraficante? They will say, of course not. Of course not. And they will get a little offended by the question. And of course, you know, as a journalist, you don't want them to get offended if you are there, of course. So then the second question is, are you part of the cartel? And they will say, of course not. So then the question is, what is a cartel then? If people that are making their living by, you know, cultivating marijuana or moving marijuana or cocaine or preparing fentanyl. I was there 3 years ago in a fentanyl clandestine laboratory, and even me recording what they're doing, they will say, I'm not a drug dealer. Because they were not. If you see it from the other side, they were not dealing the drug. They were cultivating the marijuana. They were moving the so the drug dealer. So I was like, well, who is a drug dealer then? And they will say, well, the drug dealer is a person that it is, and it is even is more clear this in English than in Spanish, because in English is the person dealing the drug. Therefore, making the arrangements, especially they have the special category for the people who have a client in the US. So if you don't have a client in the US, therefore, if you don't have, this is a merchandise. So it is like you are moving as you were moving potatoes, right? Only that this is illegal, of course. But so when you talk, and Rafa was saying this, the size of the monster of this black hole is that this black hole is full of people with lives, people will that send their kids to school. I remember a story of one woman, one of my trips, and she was preparing lunch for his kiddo when I was there. It was like 8 a.m. Weekday morning, and I was like, "Oh, you're preparing lunch?" And she said, "Yeah, for my kid. How old is your kid?" And she said, she just turned 18 years old. And I said, "Oh, and what's he's working on?" And he said, "Well, we're doing marijuana right now, but we did some other things before." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And then they will do, other agricultural activity. So first, they don't consider themselves drug dealers, and second, another important part, talking about the black holes, is that it's not just full of people. It's with people that are moving the economic activities of the places where they live. Therefore, it's people making their living, buying in the local convenience store, buying the uniforms to send their kids to school, moving the local economy, partly in some cases, mostly and basically, from money that comes to the town or comes to the little village from a person that was selling the drugs to someone else, who was selling the drug to someone else, who was selling the drug to the distributor in the streets of the US, mainly in the US. Rafa is in Europe, so we don't forget about, there's a lot of Mexican drug all in Europe, so we won't let you out, Rafa. So, but these other people that are making their living are part, of course, of the economical impact of this punitive strategy that we are talking about. So what happens when the government says, okay, we're going after all of them, and they're putting a bunch of people in jail, a bunch of people that don't consider themselves drug dealers. And they're not just doing that, they are also forcing the cartels, and this happened a lot with the Los Zetas, to find other ways to get their income. Therefore, if you have a client in the US, let's say in Chicago, you are making your good money just sending the drug to Chicago, you receive the money back, either you receive a cache full of cash. This happens all day, every day in the border. Nobody checks what happens in the border from the US to Mexico, so there is no checks at all. So you can basically come back to Mexico with whatever you want, including a car full of cash, and this happens all the time, according to my sources, or of course, weapons, etc. So you will receive the cash back, and that cash will fuel the economic activity of the community. So if you approach with a punitive strategy, therefore you will be also damaging the economic activity of the community. And that will escalate. I remember when I interviewed Rafa about his article that we were making math about what's the size of it, which city. And I mentioned in my article, it could be like Mazatlan, let's say a medium city in Sinaloa. It could be like Jalapa, the capital of Veracruz in Mexico. So we're not talking about small cities. We are like entire cities that are fed by this illegal economic activity. But there are a lot of legal things that happen, the people who has the store, the people who has the local restaurant, etc., that they think that they have nothing to do with narco traffic, but they do, because most of the money that is feeding their business comes from that money that, let's say, to oversimplify things, comes in that car full of cash moving back, so crossing the border to the south without any revision or restrictions or anything. What happened, and I will try to respond a little bit to the fantastic work that Oscar has been doing. What happens if you alter that balance? Let's say, again, like happened with the case of Los Zetas. I recently, and thank you for mentioning that, Isa, had a lot of fun recording and hosting a podcast called USA versus Garcia Luna, based on a book that I wrote in the middle of the pandemic about Genaro Garcia Luna, who used to lead the Mexican security efforts. And he had a side job, so he was like the master of multitasking, because I hope he was working with the DEA. He was working for the Mexican government, and he was also working for El Chapo. Like, his side job was working for El Chapo, trying to help El Chapo and other drug dealers. These are drug dealers because they're big clients in the US, here in New York, where I'm based, in Chicago and other places. And what I learned by covering the trial of Garcia Luna after we did that podcast, the first part of the podcast was based on my book, and the second part was based on the reporting that we did almost live during the trial of Garcia Luna, from January to March of this year here in New York City. And something that it's important about that trial is that the testimonies against Garcia Luna talk a lot about what is the structural balance that exists in Mexico among the cartels, the drug dealers, the government, and other governments and institutions, like, for example, the DEA. It doesn't mean, of course, I'm not meaning with this that in the trial it was revealed that there was a secret arrangement with the DEA, nothing like that. But it is true that it was revealed how most of the things that you see in those timelines that were presented by Oscar are because of things that are really hard to capture when you're doing this high-level analysis, because you need the field research for understanding. And what they will say, and this is just a proposal for you guys, for both of you. There's a lot of information in those judicial cases in the US that gives you a lot of detail to try to build a timeline that makes more comprehensive the things that you really can see in the big picture models. Because, for example, sometimes a big war starts because somebody killed the son of the other person, like in any mafia story. In this case, what you see, for example, you see this peak in the violence in 28. Well, first in 2004 to 2007, then you see the other peak in 2008, then you see the other peak in 2010. And Oscar, for example, was talking about this 2010, like the tipping point. Why 2010 is this tipping point? So if you go to the field reporting, and what we have learned from these trials is basically because you had something that the main drug dealers in Mexico used to call the Federation. There was this arrangement of different groups that had the way that they perceive themselves is what we call the cartels. What they call is a group or a family, and basically it's a group of people that are sending drug to the same buyer. That's the oversimplified way to explain this. So if you have the same buyer and you have the other buyer and you're a supplier, then of course you are a part, but it's more a corporate, to me, is more a corporate way of organizing. In the old sense of what was a cartel, do you remember this old sense of what is the origin of the word cartel? This group of people organizing to pursue a common goal. So it is a group of people organizing to pursue a common goal. And we saw when the Federation exists, this is before 2007, that included part of what it was later the Zetas, they were working together to achieve the same common goal. For example, they will put money together in a pool. They will create these pools of money to pay for the bribes, for example. Two of my colleagues, Luis Chaparro and Anabel Hernandez, published today 2 interviews with the mini leak, one of the son of one of the most prominent, let's say, drug dealers from Mexico. And he was also referring to this pool, the pool of money that I mentioned before. So if you have a common goal to buy, for example, a politician, or to buy the leader of the Mexican police, this person will ask for a lot of money. But if we all have the same objective, which is basically have this person putting a blind eye into us sending the drugs, so it makes sense that we put money together and they're serving this person is serving all of us at the same time. So if you see, it's again this corporate strategy that we will see in regular legal corporations. So we see it's like the lobbying of the cartels, sort of. So you will see, for example, Coca-Cola putting a lot of money lobbying in the US Congress. And you will see the members of the federation putting a lot of money to lobby Genaro Garcia Luna, for example. So they will be doing this until something happened in 2007, as you can see in the models that Oscar presented. And in those models, you will see then that there was an abrupt change, and that change was, of course, fueled again by the government. Some people that were detained, for example, Ociel Cárdenas at one moment, other like big names detention. And this was fueled by the decision from the government that we will need to go for these big numbers. And this is something I have been spoken with Alejandro for years, Rafa, so it is true. He explained this to me for the first time, how Los Zetas needed then to find another ways to fund themselves, basically. So what they created is that so my leader, who was the person with the arrangement with the buyer in Chicago, is detained. So I don't have a buyer anymore. Therefore, I need to find a new buyer so I can send the drug to the US. But in the meantime, I still have people under me. I need to pay my payroll. I need to keep bribing people, because if I stop putting the money in the pool for the bribes, I won't receive any protection anymore. Therefore, I'll be detained. So I will still need to have some inflows in my cash flow, even if my buyer is not picking up the phone anymore because he doesn't know me. He knew my boss, but now my boss is detained. So how do? You need to find alternative sources of income. And this was mainly for the Zetas, was mainly kidnapping people in Mexico. So you will be kidnapping people. You will see clearly in the numbers the peak of the extortion. You will see a lot of local crime that was peaking because this all of that money was barely covering the same amount of inflows that this group will have before, when they have a better relationship with the buyer in the US. So you will see in this, again, it's oversimplifying example, how the decisions that were made from the government without enough context about what will be the economic consequences, and therefore the violent consequences within the cartels. And then you will see something that Rafa worked really well for his article, that is, then you will have a lot of people trying to work with you and work for you, and sometimes working for less money for you because there are not other sources of income, not just within the cartel, but also in the city. So all of a sudden, this city is receiving less money. Therefore, there is less money and less work. Therefore, there is more people willing to work for the cartels because they don't have another sources of income. So you have a lot of recruitment from people who are willing to have a job. And frankly, that's one of the things that keeps me really worried about what's happening this week in Acapulco, because in a place like Acapulco, when you have 2 years of upcoming recovery, you will have a lot of kids now in a vulnerable position to be recruited, because there is no economic activity, there is no tourism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it works in the same logic. So what has been happening, and I will wrap up with this, in the last years, is that you have been having a government, 3 different governments, first Calderón and then Peña Nieto and now López Obrador, changing the public speech about this, but not changing really the strategy. They have been sending a lot of people, a lot of, army and the military are there. They're trying to suppress the moving of drugs. They are really not addressing the other economic problems that exist in those communities. Therefore, people still are vulnerable to work for the cartels as their means of income, for the lack of other opportunities. And they have been basically filling the prisons that we have in Mexico, we have, they have been wasting a whole generation of people in many cases of many cities. And right now we are seeing an increase, but it is a really particular increase in the places, and you will see this clearly in every case when the government has been trying to come in and detain the leaders. And every time you will detain the leader, and this has been discussed so much over the years, you have been atomizing the organization. Therefore, the new leaders are people who are less experienced, have less clear line of command. Everything is a mess, and they don't have a client. Therefore, they will need to come back and look for sources of income in the community. Therefore, you will see an increase again in extortion, kidnapping, local crime, etc. What's happening right now is that Mexico is heavily switching to producing massively fentanyl. And something that is really dangerous is that the Mexican government keeps saying that there is no fentanyl labs in Mexico, which is really worrying, because they are not addressing really the size of the beast, and it's not been addressed also in the US. So that's the situation right now. I will wrap it up with it for now, and I'm happy to respond to any other things.
Thank you, Penile, for these ideas. You bring us definitely some of the major problems and the things that neither maths nor data science can capture. And the goal of this seminar, at least, is not to use one mathematical model to capture the whole thing. Poor Rafael and his colleagues. But definitely to combine methods and combine knowledge so that we can approach to better strategies. So this is going to be the theme of the second half of this presentation. What are the strategies? And some of the participants in our room have already addressed those. What would you suggest then the strategy should be? Having all this on the table, and some of the ideas that also Penile address about the judicial systems, the overpopulated prisons. We know that there's a market of supply and demand that is not in Vienna, but it is in our region. So so there's other factors that play. You guys, please. Give us some of those ideas, and we will wrap up our seminar series today with that. Oscar, I'll give you the floor now for your final remarks.
Thank you so much, Isa. Thank you, Rafa and Penile. I really enjoyed your presentations. Rafa, I have read your work and I admire it very much. So, thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for the questions. I think they're great. They are very complex questions. I feel that I absolutely agree with Penile. I think that it's a very complex phenomenon, and it's difficult to fully, understand all of its complexity with only, the use of models, right? And in that sense, I agree 100% with that statement. First of all, and I just wanted to start here, I think that to our defense, in a way, I do feel that even though this is a very complex phenomenon, and literally we would have to take, or understand the whole phenomenon, with a case-by-case approach, almost, right? Which would take us probably, too many years, and then it wouldn't matter anyway. One of the things that we're trying to do, I feel, Rafa and I, or people that are trying to take this approach, is we're trying to find patterns, right? Larger patterns that, of course, maybe they don't fully explain the phenomenon in all of its complexity, right? However, it allows us to understand certain underlying factors, right, that are driving, right, some of these phenomena that we're talking about right now, and that is why I feel that these models are important, right? And these sort of approaches are important because they allow us to identify, right, certain things that policymakers or journalists, scholars, the society in general can say, okay, this might be important, right? Maybe this is something we should be addressing right now, right? And so in that sense, I do feel that there's a value in trying to really pursue these models and these sort of like more like macro understanding of the phenomenon. Although you are correct, I feel that a lot of its complexity is lost, right, when implementing them, and there should be a balance always, right, trying to complement both sides. So great questions, very complex questions. I think it would probably take us a lot of time to fully address them, but I feel that going back to a structure where a few organizations controlled most of the territory, right, and had like balanced arrangements between them is unlikely, right? This was, and I do feel that the structure of organized crime is highly interrelated, highly linked with the political system, right? And this is something, that Viridiana Rios and many other scholars have already talked about years ago. There is a very strong relationship between the political system and the politics, the way the politics are made, and organized crime, right? Now, what we have, given the fragmentation of all these organizations over the years, now we have many small, we have big organizations, but also we have many small criminal organizations that have established arrangements, right? Corrupt arrangements with local governments, right? State, municipal, and so on, and might be too embedded, right, in the local dynamics of power, right? So, thinking and going to some of the questions that the audience made, how can we go back to a more like balanced situation? As of now, I think that's very difficult, right? Now that we are in this sort of like mess, I think it would be very difficult to go back, because uprooting these smaller organizations that have fragmented and now have sort of like made their arrangements with the local sort of like politics and politicians and so on, it's going to be very difficult. Instead of following a uniform strategy, I do think that the government should acknowledge these complexities, right, and understand that talking about organized crime, first of all, and very similar to what Penelli mentioned, we're talking about the people, right? Organized crime is not something that happens up in the air, right? Organized crime, and this is also something, very much related to Rafa's point, this is the people, right? So waging a war against organized crime in a way is waging a war against your people, right? So how should we be thinking about this, right? Are we thinking about it in the right way? Is waging a war, the way to go? And but by the same token, is the politics of hugs and no bullets, which is a lie, by the way, because that's not what's happening. Is that also the correct approach? I don't think so. I think that the government has to have control of its territory, right? But a way to do it, and this goes back to Mark Kleinman, a research scientist at UCLA. He proposed that a way to tackle this violence is to attack militarily the most violent organizations, right? So only focus on those. Organized crime is going to stay. It's here to stay. It's not going to disappear. Organized crime, drug trafficking, it's going to be impossible to eliminate. It's going to stay. So the question is, what type of organized crime do we want? There's organized crime in Europe. There's organized crime in Japan, in every single country around the world. What kind of organized crime do we want? And a potential idea that I think is interesting is maybe tackling the most violent ones, such that the society suffers, the least possible. Maybe that could be an option. I'm gonna leave it there because I know that I want other people to talk as well. Thank you.
Oh yes, of course, and I will add something too, because one of the other assets of applying these methods and having these very thoughtful discussions is also because we need to assess the policies. Like the research of Rafael is a wonderful tool to assess any policy of education of poverty or so and so. But we also need these tools for doing intelligence. And who should be doing intelligence in Mexico? Everyone, every NGO, every think tank, every journalist, every police. And there's zero capacities these days of that. So we still have a lot to work on that. And Rafael, please share your final remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Isa. One of the comments first I would make is that we have a very severe labeling issue, because of course, Penny was saying, like, when you ask these people, they don't actually consider themselves cartel members. And I totally agree. But the same happens with political terrorism, with corrupts. If you ask a politician, are you corrupt? They would say no. If you ask a religion extremists, are you terrorists? They would also say no. So for me, they are drawing the boundary into what is cartel member and not obviously becomes impossible when there are all these gray areas. And that's why we said, okay, let's try to count them all, because the data will show all, the murders will show all, the incapacitations try to show them all, so let's keep them all. But second, also for me, a labeling issue comes in even referring to the cartels as narco cartels, as this is a drug issue. Because for me, drugs are just a tiny part of the problem. We don't know how tiny, but it's just a part. And it's a part because then you turn to Mexico and you see huachicol, gachicol, organs trafficking, migrants trafficking. Every single shop in Mexico has experienced at some point of another extortion, especially if they are bars and restaurants. And when people keep their idea that this is drugs, then you have very traditional solutions such as, oh, let's legalize. And I'm not against legalization, by the way, it's just that, and the rest of the problems, what are we going to do with extortion? If you only solve a part of it, and you have still 175,000 people that are trained on how to do extortion, how to use a gun, how to shoot people, then you can legalize whatever, but you will still have 175,000 members, no? So that is, for me, one of the tricky challenge. That's how do we actually solve this problem? And part of the thing that I mentioned in the presentation always is the recruitment. And it's the recruitment because part of what I've seen in Mexico is the narco culture. What we're observing now in my screen is the birthday party of an 11-year-old that was themed after La Chapiza. Now, this is a famous football player, son. I don't even know the football player, by the way, but I just knew about the party because it was in the social media. Now, with these kids, what are they expecting? And if you've seen what happened in Chiapas in the subsequent days, when have you ever seen a scientist being received by their colony, or a football player, or a singer, or a dancer, or an architect, or whatever you want to think of? What are those teenagers standing there thinking of? And for me, this was precisely the point of recruitment. That today we have such a valuable, such a positive view on culture that is this type of images that we see in Mexico. So finally, what about other options? Something super critical is that at the same time that we're discussing this, we have the situation in El Salvador, So something that frequently people ask is, why don't we follow like El Salvador? For those in the audience that are not familiar, in El Salvador, they imprisoned almost everyone that just has a tattoo, that is slightly tan in their skin, and looks suspicious, that is male. Anyone is in prison today. And why we should never follow this process. There are many reasons. One is the violation of human rights of every single person that is there, not even a right for a right judgment. But then second, and something that Penile mentioned, the size of this is like taking away cities size from the economical population in the country. In El Salvador, they have 2% of its population in prison. That means roughly 4% of their economical population in prison. So can a country as poor as El Salvador pay the price of having 4% of its activity or its population in prison? I don't think so. I don't think this is sustainable, not economically viable. And maybe actually this is detrimental when it creates even more poverty and more inequalities. So is this the solution? I don't think so. For me, again, goes into the recruitment, goes into talking about this narco culture in Mexico, going into this, what was this football player thinking? But this is the one that we saw. There are thousands that we're not seeing, where now we have to take back the desirability of the narco culture. And just the one fact, I finish. When you join a cartel, you are joining a group that is 95 times more likely to suffer a murder than a person in the street. 95 times more violent. So that is when you join a cartel. This is the message that we should give to these people, to these teenagers that are joining the cartel. When you join, you, your family, and your neighbors are 95 times more likely to be the victims of a murder. And with that, I finish.
Thank you so much. Very compelling. Penny, for the final remarks.
Well, thank you so much. I totally agree with Oscar that finding pattern is only the way to try to understand the big picture, and therefore try to move these communities from what Rafa was explaining, with this sometimes seems to be endless relationship with crime, to other sources of income, other possibilities for their lives. If we go back to, most of these communities are full of people that even working for the drug dealers, even working for the cartels, they remain poor. They are living in poverty anyway. There is really not, we can say that Mexico has been doing something, especially during, this current government. They have been saying that they have been addressing the economical sources, that they have been that they have been preventing young people to come up to the crime. But we have seen that that's not true. I remember from one of my trips, I met one person that was delivering the help, the government help to every people older than 60 years old. And one of the people recipients of that was the mother of El Chapo, who will say, and we could say that maybe she didn't need it, she had a wealthy son. So maybe she didn't need this help from the government to get her out of poverty, but she was receiving it. So the way that the government of Mexico has been trying to say that it will be helping everyone, no matter what are your characteristics, etc. At least in my field trips, what's happening is that people are receiving help from the government and they continue working for the cartels. So it's like two sources of income, because the help that they are receiving from the government is mostly, and this is mainly the most controversial thing, and I will say today, is mostly this model that, of course, is not leftist at all, is this model that looks more like the US after the 70s, when the US became this place of inequality where you receive a lot of money from the government, but you don't have real opportunities. There is no building of institutions. There is no building of real opportunities. There is only cash on hand. As the School of Chicago, let's say, will love to. And finally, I want to respond to what Oscar said about the all the studies, the good studies about the interrelationship between the political system and the drug dealers and the cartels. I will say that going back to what I mentioned before about following these trials added to the field reporting is so useful, because when you have these criminals that are now in prison in the US or have, they are on the witness protection in the US, and they come and they give their testimony during trials here in the US, they don't explain only what pertains to the person that they're testifying against. They explain how the whole system operates. And I remember, for example, that one of the columns that I wrote during the trial of Garcia Luna, I called it the narco state, because it was I was using the testimony of Edgar Beitia, who was the general attorney for Nayarit, one of the states in Mexico when you have a wider presence of criminal organized activities. And he was explaining how, crime and states were working as a team in so many levels. And so all the time, I recently have been working on investigative reporting about the Ayotzinapa case, and that's another case when you see this imbrication and you see how narco and state are the same thing, are part of the same team in many cases. So when you have specific goals, let's say from the government to go after one particular person or extradite someone because they have receiving a lot of political pressure, they do it because basically they know where they are. It's not like, Ovidio Guzman was detaining Jesus Maria, who is the small town where he grew up with his mother. So it was not that he was detained in the middle of nowhere in a place that was, oh my God, it's impossible to find. He was detained in his mother's hometown, where he has been located so many times before. And one of the times that El Chapo was detained and after he was with his mistress he escaped, and he was in Los Mochis, in a place where everybody knew that he was. And if you ask in Sinaloa, a lot of people know where El Mayo Zambada is. So it's not like they are hiding in the middle of nowhere and it's impossible to capture them. So and that happens because they're working as a team, and also because there are a lot of issues, but that's like enough for an entire new panel about what are the things that are unresolved things about the public service in Mexico, the justice system, and all the things that are wrong in Mexico with the police.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this exchange of ideas. Powerful words that you share with us today. Oscar Contreras, Rafael Prieto Curiel, and Penile Ramirez. I would also thank and give special thanks to Ana Cardenas and Sofia Cruz in Semeca, Columbia University, who have been helping us streaming and producing this seminar. Fernando Santillan at UNAM and Hector Zavala at UNAM Boston too. And the next seminar, please come and join us November 17. We are going to discuss the use of these tools in the hands of the bad actors. We're going to hear this from Alexei Kovac from Russia. Very, very interesting examples on how these tools can be used by these kind of governments. And Robert Bacon from Utica University is also going to join this discussion on the practical side. So thank you so much, Rafa, Oscar, Penny. It was great seeing you today, and we're on time finishing. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.